Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Grace Holland. Helene is now the deadliest hurricane to hit the mainland United States since Katrina. Relief efforts are continuing to pour into the western part of our state, where power and road access is slowly being restored. Helping those efforts are members of the North Carolina National Guard and Fort Liberty soldiers. Earlier this week, WRAL's Heidi Kirk was embedded with the National Guard as they deployed to some of the hardest hit areas. She joins me by phone. Heidi, thanks for being here.
Hey, Grace.
Heidi, how did you get this very unique assignment?
Well, Grace, it's kind of an interesting story. So I was out of town over the weekend and I got a call from one of my managers on a Sunday morning, which is a little bit unusual. And what she said is that we had the opportunity to send one reporter to be embedded with the North Carolina National Guard. And it's really interesting because what she said is we don't have a lot of information about it. She didn't know what we'd be doing, where we'd be going. We knew that we'd be headed out west to one of the hardest hit communities in the area, but we weren't sure exactly where that would be. And the other thing is I could be gone from 1 day to up to 5 days. So there were a lot of unknowns out there, but I'm the type of person that's kind of just ready to jump in any way that I can. And I said yes immediately.
Right. I think as reporters, a lot of us, you get some kind of crazy opportunity like that and you're like, okay, yeah, that sounds different and something I haven't experienced. Let's go. And so you're on the way out there. I'm sure you were, monitoring through the weekend, like what was going on, what we knew about the storms at that point. So, did you have any sense of what to expect?
I really didn't. I had communicated with a member of the National Guard who was kind of facilitating my embed. And I got details late Sunday night that I would be headed out early Monday morning. And of course, I live over in Rocky Mount as the Eastern North Carolina reporter. And I had to meet them over at 9 a.m. in Burlington, over at the Emergency Management Center. That was going to be our first stop of the morning. So I left bright and early from Rocky Mount, headed all the way to Burlington, where I met a couple members of the National Guard that handle some of the media relations. So I basically hopped in the car with them, and they told me that our first stop was going to be at the Morganton Regional Readiness Center, which is basically a hub for the National Guard in that area. So it was quite a long ride to get there, several hours. And once we pulled in, we got to connect with the rest of the group that we were going to be headed down west to. And we spent a little bit of time there just kind of preparing for the mission. I asked a lot of questions about, when exactly do you know where you're going to be going? Because up to this point, none of us knew. And eventually we got an assignment, and all that the Guard knew was that we were going to be headed to Asheville. And I asked the question, what are we going to be doing? And at this point, they still didn't know. They told me that until we got onto the ground, the first line of business is going to be connect with emergency management in that area. And they're really there to step in pretty much any way that they can. And, along the road to Asheville, we headed down I-40. It actually hadn't even reopened to any general public. It was just completely shut down in some areas. But because I was with the National Guard, we were allowed to cruise on through. And it was really fascinating. Along the road, we started to see signs of destruction pretty early on, the closer that we got to Asheville. So, first it was areas where there was just debris along the side of the road, kind of general areas where there's storms going through. But then it was like I started to notice things like mudslides, like areas where clearly dirt and debris had slid down some of the mountains. And then the closer that we got to Asheville, I noticed, homes that clearly had been abandoned, businesses that were not open, broken glass, all sorts of things like that. And really some of those images that we've all been seeing online for several days now that are really quite jarring.
Right. So at one point when you guys finally get to Asheville, do you kind of get a sense of what the plan is?
So it's really interesting. We headed first to a warehouse, which is essentially set up to be kind of a supply distribution center. And I'm not going to disclose where exactly that warehouse was. The National Guard and the members of emergency management that we were working with made it very clear that it's important to keep those locations anonymous because unfortunately there has been quite a bit of looting. But this is a facility where people are dropping off supplies and then other organizations can distribute them out into the community. And so when we got there, the first thing was to connect with our point of contact at that facility. And that person was supposed to give us some information about, how exactly we were going to go about our first mission. And it took a little bit of time, but eventually we got that first mission. It could have been anything from, rescues, supply drops, debris clearance, which is actually what a couple members of the National Guard that I was with told me they thought it would be. They thought we'd be clearing debris. But once, we kind of got things sorted out, we did learn that we were going to be part of a group that was going to be handling supply drops. And, the National Guard pretty much will do anything that they're asked. Something that I learned over the course of the last few days is that they can step in a number of ways. And some of the jobs that I just listed, it's essentially to assist the emergency management in that community that has been hard hit. And so once we got that assignment, we essentially learned that we were going to be, taking flats of water, food, diapers, toilet paper, any of those essential supplies that we talk so much about, and distributing them to local fire departments and schools and areas where helicopters were going to be landing to pick up those supplies and distributing them to locations that were completely cut off. And so that's kind of what the next couple days looked like as far as what they were doing.
All right, let's take a quick break right there and we'll talk about how all that went. Heidi, before the break, you were describing all of the journey that it took to get out to Asheville with the National Guard, and then once you guys kind of got your orders for what you were going to be doing, how did that mission go? What worked and what didn't?
Well, Grace, there's a lot of challenges out there out west, as we've talked about over the last few days or so. One of the biggest ones is there's no cell signal in most areas. And this is something that, I wasn't prepared for. I assumed that it would be spotty, but I didn't realize that I would be essentially cut off from, most people back at our newsroom in Raleigh, family, friends. I couldn't get in contact with anyone. And that's not an issue that I was facing alone. Of course, everyone who's been going through this tragedy in Western North Carolina knows that. And it's something that the National Guard experienced too. The group that I was with didn't have a Starlink, didn't have a way to get connected. They were kind of relying on the facility that we went to have those things, and unfortunately it didn't. And, it was really tough. I was watching them in real time, navigate some pretty intense communication issues. And I mentioned before the break that it took us quite a while to actually get that first assignment. And that's because it's hard to communicate with the point of contact whenever you don't have cell signal, they don't have cell signal. I mean, it really is quite devastating out there as far as communication goes. And another thing, there's no gas. We passed probably a dozen gas stations on our way into Asheville, and none of them were open. And the ones that were even open had, long lines out the door trying to get gas. And from what I know, there wasn't any gas. It was just absolutely devastating. And so these are all things the National Guard had to navigate alongside, regular civilians that are out there. It took them longer than normal to try to communicate with their points of contact. I actually spoke with, a higher up member of the National Guard via Zoom today. And essentially what she told me is that this is not something that they've faced to this magnitude before. She said it's been really tough, and they're actively working to try to deploy different ways of getting on the internet so that they can communicate. As far as gas goes, at one point we were able to make a journey outside of Asheville to another location that had gas for emergency responders and groups like the National Guard. But, again, it's really not easy. But I also want to highlight some of the good. It did take some time to get acclimated, but, I just checked the most recent numbers from the North Carolina National Guard, and up to this point, over the last week, they've donated or they picked up and distributed 600,000 pounds of food and water and supplies into the Asheville area and beyond. That is a really massive number, and it really goes a long way. And along with that, they've also rescued by ground 450 people. That is a lot of people when you really think about the numbers. They've also been delivering emergency supplies. There's just a magnitude of ways that they help out. And, not all of this is so visible. I really got a chance chance to be an embed and see what it takes and what it looks like to be a part of the National Guard. And, I think that some of us, it's hard to see the work that they do, but a lot of this is happening behind the scenes. And, from my experience, I can assure you that that group that I was with was working hard, trying to make sure that they could assist emergency management and the other groups on the ground in any way that they can.
Right. And it is such incredible work that they are doing, along with so many other people that are out there trying to help get people the relief that they need. And, you just mentioned, the insight that you gained into the National Guard and how they work as a unit, but also how they respond to these kind of situations. I wonder how you're reflecting on your time being out there in Western Carolina and just seeing the devastation firsthand.
Well, Grace, it's interesting because I spent some time trying to prepare in advance. I think we all took, the first few days of this tragedy to really soak up all of the media, all of the pictures, all of the videos that we were getting out of Western North Carolina. And I thought that I was prepared to see some of the devastation that was out there. But honestly, the biggest takeaway is that area was hit so hard. And I think it's something that's, easy to find online, but the pictures don't really do it justice, and the areas that we were barely scraped the surface. I mean, there are entire teams with the National Guard that we know are clearing paths to make sure that people who are cut off from society can get out of their homes and, get food and water, those other essential supplies. And it was quite jarring to hear those stories from real people on the ground, from other members of the National Guard. And, it just gave me a whole different perspective. And something else that I want to add is, I think that, we think when these big groups with more resources come in that they're going to be set up for success. But, these people were also lacking cell signal. They didn't have gas. That night we slept on the floor of a warehouse, the same warehouse that we were, gathering those supplies and getting them out into the community. I mean, that is the only place that they were able to stay that night. And it's something that's really powerful. And just spending, 2 days with the National Guard, it gave me a whole different perspective on what exactly they do and how, just like many of the people who live in that community, just like us as journalists, we're navigating those same challenges. So it was a really empowering and really fascinating experience for me overall.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Heidi. We appreciate you doing that and letting us know what it was like on the inside there. And we obviously appreciate the work that the National Guard is doing, too. Thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.